This is Content, a monthly podcast featuring technical communicators, content strategists, and web content professionals. I'm Ed Marsh. This is episode number 4, recorded June 7th, 2015. This is actually take 2 since I had a hard drive failure last week. Today's guest is Tom Johnson. How's it going in California there, Tom?
Things are going well. It's a nice sunny day. The weather's turned really warmer now, and things are just kind of kicking into summer here. Kids are out.
Nice. Good stuff. All right. If you don't know Tom, he's consistently been the most influential and most prolific technical writer in our field. He podcasts, he videocasts, he blogs almost continuously. You can find it all at I'dRatherBeWriting.com. You can also find Tom on Twitter at Tom Johnson. I'll be honest. Sorry, Tom. Didn't really like him very much when I first heard about him, but basically because I viewed him as competition. Then I started reading his stuff, realized he really does know what he's talking about, and there's a reason why he's an influential techcomm person. He's definitely technical, he gets really in-depth with his stuff, and probably most importantly, he's passionate about his topics. But then, you know what, I still wanted to beat him. So when I started this podcast, I considered Tom to be one of those must-haves once I reached some notoriety, some stature. So I'm terribly happy to have him on today. He gave us a great review of our first 2 podcasts, so thanks, Tom. And thanks for taking your time today.
Yeah, hey, I'm excited to be on this podcast. I mean, I was excited to see you emerge onto the podcasting scene. There really haven't been very many techcomm podcasters. Probably only 2 others that I've seen, and both of them have faded out, and I've kind of fizzled out as well. So I go in spurts, but I'm excited to see your shows.
Understood.
And I think you do a great job at interviewing your guests. So
I appreciate that, Tom. Thanks very much. You can find his review of our podcast at I'dRatherBeWriting.com. And the reason why I started the podcast was because, like Tom said, he was really the only one in our field who was podcasting on a regular basis. So I found a niche, and I'm hoping to fill it, and thankful that Tom is with us today. So, Tom, you've really had kind of an interesting path to becoming a tech writer. Can you share that path with us?
Sure. So I started out as an English major in college, and then kind of postponed real life for a few months or for a few years by getting an MFA in creative writing, and actually got that in New York, at New York City, Columbia, for 3 years.
Oh, nice.
And I actually learned a ton. None of it really applies to the field of technical writing. It more comes out on my blog, to be honest. But it's really difficult to make a living either teaching or writing creatively. So eventually I turned to tech writing out of financial necessity, but found that it wasn't so bad and actually quite liked it. I liked working with tech teams, project managers, engineers, QA. I liked figuring things out. I'd always, even as a teacher, I'd always created websites, interactive websites for students, and I really liked that element of it. And I had a colleague who said, you'd be the perfect technical writer. And I said, no, it's so boring and lifeless. And I had flashbacks of this techcomm professor in college, or professional writing person in college, who was really quite boring. She talked about, formatting of phone books, and I was like, oh, come on, But so yeah, the background in creative writing is I wish I had a background in programming, but you have what you have. But I'd learned a few things about writing that I think have helped me on my blog, and one of them, I studied nonfiction writing, creative nonfiction, not fiction. And one of the interesting things about nonfiction is this balance between information and stories, which I think has the perfect application in blog posts. And if you think about a good blog post, it's got you learn something, but it's somewhat anecdotal, and you see a kind of experience of the person. And trying to make that work together towards an interesting read is something that I find fascinating, and it's partly why I like to blog. It's an expression of this creative energy, channeled towards a subject, technical writing, that is not necessarily focused on me, but is talking about the profession in general, but through the lens of personal experience.
Right. Okay. Yeah. When I knew I had to get myself out there a bit more, I saw the blog and I saw your blog, and I'm like, you know what? When I come home at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is write more. So that's where the podcast came in, hoping to fill that niche. But good for you. And your blog most recently, you really came out with a very honest, I guess, personal view of where you are and how you became a tech writer. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Is this my career day post?
Yes.
Okay. Oh no. That post got a ton of comments, and I think it hit a nerve in a lot of people who have creative backgrounds or creative energy and are trying to figure out how they make that work in the techcomm world, and why it is that why it is that people don't seem to have any interest. At least students don't seem to have any interest in what we're doing. Is it really so boring and lifeless? What do we do with all this creative energy? But no, that you can find that on my blog. I've kind of trended in the past towards more technical posts. The comparison between DITA and Jekyll, and they didn't really get very many hits and reads.
Oh, interesting.
I
should change my questions.
no, the personal story posts are always better. But yeah, so. Now I feel like I'm just kind of rambling, so I don't have anything more to say on that.
It's all good. Yeah, it was like I said, it was a very raw post, a lot of emotion in it. You could see some of your frustration, no one, basically, for those of you who haven't seen the post yet, Tom went and had a technical writing booth at Career Day at his child's school, didn't get a lot of reception. Of course, the chef who was giving them food, who was right next door, got a lot of the attention. But I know Tom was a little frustrated because there were no one coming to his booth, and he's like, where are all the young tech writers? So I'm hoping that some of them will pick up the slack as you and I age.
Yeah, well, I will say just one comment on the post. I think in college, a lot of us read literature and the classics, and we really got into the more literary side of things. And then to be a good technical writer, in all honesty, you have to devote a lot of time to learning technical things, programming, other technical concepts, tools. Without that kind of background, you're just going to be kind of a 9-to-5 monkey at your job, just like typing in and going home. But yeah, to really move forward, to be like somebody who's really an expert, you pretty much have to give up that creative side and throw yourself into a lot of learning of technical things, and that's somewhat hard to do, but it's rewarding at the same time. Actually, probably a couple of years ago, I was trying to figure out what to do with my career, how to focus it, because I'd heard that you're supposed to specialize in things. People said so I tried specializing kind of in video tutorials or maybe community engagement, but there really aren't. Those aren't the best options. I'm convinced 100% that the best specialization for the techcomm career now is API documentation. It's just something that has exploded on the scene since in the last 10 years or 5 years. Almost every web service out there wants to get other people using their services, and so they provide these APIs so that you can plug in and grab what you want from their content. And the documentation for these APIs is all over the place. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for technical writers, but it presents more of a challenging landscape because you really have to have some familiarity with some level of programming or the technical aspects of it to really excel.
Right. Yeah. And like you, I kind of fell into the field. I went to school for journalism, so not too far from what you did. I was going to write for the New York Times someday. And when I went for my first tech writing interview, I didn't even know what tech writing was. But I knew that I was the kind of kid who liked pressing buttons and seeing what things did. Somehow I managed to get to the job, and that was 21 years ago. And it kind of seems to have worked out. But like you, I've always been really interested in the technical kind of stuff. I always wanted to be everything but a technical writer. I wanted to be a designer. I wanted to be a programmer. I wanted to be anything but the guy who writes all day. And then really in the past year or two, I said, I really kind of like this content stuff, and that's kind of where I want to go. Also, I wasn't that very good of a designer, and if you know anything about the New York job field, there's not a lot of design jobs. So everything's, like I said, everything's kind of worked out in a weird way. And now I'm comfortable in my skin of being a tech writer.
That's interesting.
So,
I didn't know you had aspirations toward journalism. That's great. And your background and your other things.
yeah, I realize I haven't really shared much about myself on these podcasts, so that's a new one. But yeah, I went to school for journalism, fell in love with it, and then those jobs don't pay so much, as you know. And this job, tech writing, came to me, and it's like I said, that my first job. I was there 12 years, and it's all kind of worked out. So happy to be here.
Well, good.
Okay. So Tom, you're very big social media at Tom Johnson on Twitter. At what point did you start looking into social media and really get into it?
Well, I started out as a webmaster for the Suncoast STC chapter, and I was I moved their site from HTML files to a WordPress site, and I was playing around with WordPress. This is back in 2005, and I tried to get like a group blog going among the chapters just to get people contributing, but nobody really did. You really had to ask people multiple times, and they barely sent you anything. And eventually it just began to be me posting on this Suncoast STC blog. And I said, why am I doing this? I don't want this chapter site to be like all about me and my thoughts and views on techcomm. So I branched out and created my own site and just started posting there. And that kind of took off. I've always been fascinated by I've been fascinated by the fact that a person who writes can be so visible in a community of writers. Like I would think there would be a lot more technical writers who write, but I guess as you say, you get done at the end of the day and you're tired of writing and you want to switch modes. For me, when I switch modes into blogging mode, it's like it kicks into a different part of my brain or something because I feel like I've got energy for it. But yeah, anyway, started out just working with a chapter site and transitioned into my own.
Oh, that's cool. And at what point did you add Twitter to your repertoire?
Oh, I don't know. Whenever Twitter started to become big, I'm not really that prominent on Twitter. Like a lot of these other social media channels, I basically engage kind of tiptoeing in there and tiptoeing out. Some people are much more interesting on Twitter. I mostly just kind of push out news about new posts. It's too small of a format. I mean, if you want to express yourself, you want to get into something, you can't do that in 140 characters. I use Twitter to kind of figure out what the pulse of techcomm is for the day. Try to get news. Has anybody written or done anything interesting, released anything interesting? So I'll check the techcomm feed. But yeah, that's about it on Twitter. And all these social networks have a place, and they have different strengths and weaknesses.
Right. Okay. So I guess then, since you transferred into techcomm and when you started blogging and then moved to your own site, did you ever have a thought that at some point, hey, I'm going to be the leader in this space, or did it just kind of happen? Or was it a little bit of both?
All right, so I have to address the whole leader thing because whenever I hear that, I just kind of chuckle because I don't really consider myself a leader. I'm visible in techcomm, and certainly people know me through my blog. But if you look at like what are the forces that are shaping technical communication, what are the people? Not the people, but what are the things that are making our profession how it is? I think I play like a tiny minuscule less than 0.1% part of that. I think that I don't really know exactly who shapes techcomm, but certainly, the blogosphere is only a fraction of the people. If you go to these techcomm conferences and you look around, a lot of people aren't even online. They have no idea about like who techcomm bloggers are. The techcomm blogosphere is small. It's like I could probably name 100 people, and that would be it of the people who are active blogging in this space, and that's a small fraction. And that even if all the people blogging were writing about something, it's not going to really shape techcomm. I mean, you've got the forces that shape techcomm are programs. They're the web momentum itself, publishing tools, conferences. So all that stuff just kind of comes together. Anyway,
I agree and disagree. Tech, the web, all that drives us, but it's the people behind the tech that really make a difference. And you're, intentional or not, you're that guy. You're the guy that's, if someone wants to look up tech writing, they go to Tom Johnson. Now, for those people who aren't online, we're a bunch of writers. Shouldn't we all be blogging?
This is okay. If I get like several questions frequently, this is one of them. Is how do you find the time to write? So I've heard that question at least I hear it a lot. Okay, and I think most technical writers would find the time to write if they weren't completely, if they didn't view blogging as tech writing. I think that tech writing is very explanatory. It's procedural. It's like, hey, I figured out how to do this. Here are the steps. Blogging is a different mode. You're exploring. A good blog is not explaining something. You're asking a question and you're trying to find the answer through the writing process. That's what the original term was by Montaigne. He viewed his essays as trials or attempts. Where you start off with a topic and you have this point B in the distance that you're trying to get to, and you're not really sure how to get there. It's not like how do you install this or how do you implement this. I think when you switch into that other mode, then techcomm or the blogging aspect starts to come alive, and you find that you do have energy and it is more interesting. So I think if more tech writers did that, they would go online. But then again, tech writing, you only have so many years in your life. You want to spend it writing about techcomm. I mean, spend it with your family. Go out. Do something that you find meaningful. If writing isn't that, then definitely shouldn't be blogging just for the sake of blogging. Right,
and that's what I just couldn't find the time to do it. It wasn't a priority, and I just wasn't. When I did personal stuff on my blog, no one came. And then eventually some of the technical stuff that I wrote, actually there's a blog post I wrote about CSS and Flare 5 years ago. It's still my number one hit blog post, which drives me crazy because it's 5 years ago.
This is what was happening in creative writing school. So we had all these people who were trying to come up with material to write about. And none of us were 20-somethings that are all in these creative writing classes, and you have to produce 20 pages or something to share, and you end up writing personal experiences that nobody really cares about. And maybe you did have an interesting life or an interesting time, and it's a great personal narrative, but that genre is dead unless you're a friend of the person or if you're famous or something. So the real... This is something I learned from a guy named Lawrence Weschler. He said you have to focus outside yourself on some other topic. And so it's part of the tension that I was talking about earlier between the information and story. If you just write story and it's all pointing back at you, it comes across as these navel-gazing personal experiences. But if you look outward at something else, but you talk about it through the personal lens, the eye and so forth, then it does seem to work a lot more. Anyway, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on that. That's not really probably of much interest to the techcomm community, but I mean, if you are starting out in blogging, find this balance between information and personal experience and mix them together in ways that work.
Interesting. So, this is a little off, but do you find my personal pet peeve about tech writers is everyone's a good writer, but not so much on the technical. And you focus a lot, I think, on the technical side of it. Is that something that you see? Is that something you kind of agree? What's been your experience? I know you're in Silicon Valley.
Well,
do you see that balance, or is it? How does it work for you?
Well, there's obviously varying levels of what it means to be technical. Before my current job, I had applied at some other job that was like a database company, and they basically said they wanted somebody with more technical depth. I'd never really done any kind of database programming, so they were. It's totally a fair comment. I didn't have any technical depth with databases,
right.
But like, if you really want to like safeguard your career, if you want to move forward, some people choose to go managerial routes. I think those opportunities are really slim and not that exciting. If you want to advance your career, you have to go and become more specialized and more technical. In my current role, I feel like I'm barely treading water sometimes. It's a level of technical that is just like something I'm not really. I don't feel like an expert. A lot of times engineers will write something and I'll say, look, is this really how you deploy this across .NET? I have no idea because I hate going into my VM to try to check things and whatever. So yeah, a good technical writer is extremely technical, but at the same time, you have to have the ability to communicate clearly. And if you're too technical, you start to assume that your audience has more understanding than they do. You start to become impatient that they maybe don't understand things. So it can bite you at the same time, right? The curse of knowledge, where your ability to express a concept is hampered by being too much of an expert. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I try to push myself and learn it, particularly with API documentation. There's really a lot to learn, and part of this is what is fascinating about this field. When you're in regular techcomm doing GUI documentation, when you're seeing little pings on my screen. When you're in regular techcomm doing GUI documentation, I feel like you can only learn so much, and then you kind of plateau. When you switch into API documentation and you start learning programming, the landscape of technologies to learn and consume is endless, and it's like incredibly it's challenging but interesting at the same time, because it opens so many things up, and it like allows you to suddenly engage with engineers, and they understand you, and you can speak their language, right. And it's empowering, and it's fun. Makes your brain hurt sometimes, but it's like it makes the career a lot more volatile in terms of moving somewhere in a good space.
Right. And I agree with you. I mean, I don't expect every tech writer to be a programmer or be able to write code. Where I get frustrated is writers whose output is HTML and CSS and really don't know how to fix problems with it or correct it or even know what to look for. And that's where I get frustrated and think, okay, this is your tool. You should really know how it works kind of inside and out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, HTML and CSS, those are like the foundations of most tools, no matter what you're on. And if you can't figure those out, you're in trouble.
All right, and we're going to talk a little bit more about technology. But first, let me take a break here and tell everybody about Content and Info. This was my technical side project about a year ago. It's a place I put together for content strategists, user experience designers, tech writers, visual designers that come for all their daily news, including Tom's I'd rather be writing.com. So you can get it there. If not first, you can get it there same day. There's 35 over content related feeds, STC chapters, design and content strategy websites, blogs from thought leaders in all fields, including our very own Tom Johnson. When you hover over each link on the page, a summary appears so you can decide if it's right for you. It's also responsive, so you can view it on your tablet. You can view it on the go on your phone if you've got a couple of minutes during the day. If you create content on the web, please send us your feed. There's a link on contentcontent.info where you can submit your site. The links go right to your site. I don't get any information. I don't get any ads. It's just a clearinghouse, so you, as the content creator, don't miss any of those hits or those ad impressions. I created the site for the content community. Please check it out. contentcontent.info.
Hey, Ed, so question
sir.
for you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think people read content online? I mean, Google killed their feed reader, and I feel like the number of people who track RSS feeds has kind of diminished. And I'm not really sure how people figure out what they want to read. Do they just gather it from whatever social media platform they're on, or do you still see a lot of people using RSS feeds?
I don't see anybody using RSS feeds, which is actually one of the reasons that I put this site together. I was using a feed aggregator called ProtoPage, which I still use. And I use also Feedly on the go. But I was finding myself going all over the place trying to find content from design people or content strategy or tech writers. So that's kind of why I pulled it together in Drupal, which I know you and I have spoken with offline. And I pulled it together because there wasn't any place that I could go every day and say, oh, here's this site or that site and this stuff like that. So what about you? What's your RSS feed experience?
Well, it's hard to get reliable, consistently focused information in RSS feeds. I use InnoReader. After FeedBurner died, I looked for a free alternative and found InnoReader. It works fine, but when I go into my techcomm folder, it's like, it's such a miscellaneous bag of titles. It's like hard to really scan down. I like Twitter a little better because you can, the tweets that are most retweeted, you can surface to the top a bit, or you can at least you're more apt to see them, so there's some kind of ranking. But I get the most hits when I send out like a newsletter or an email distribution of a post. So anyway, it's something I'm still curious about. You mentioned something else just now though that piqued my curiosity. You've got a Drupal background, and you've done, obviously Drupal well enough to develop these custom app sites that you're talking about, but I know you're also a DITA person. So how do you kind of manage this split worldview between your DITA, your Drupal expertise, where you're doing a lot of advanced web publishing, and then you've got your DITA tool set where you're probably publishing tech docs? Do you see that as a split, or is that not a split?
Oh, definite split. I would not at all call myself a Drupal expert. I call myself a Drupal enthusiast, and actually quite recently I've kind of fallen off. I was involved. Well, what happened? My background in Drupal is when I became a member of our condo community, we had no website. They were shutting it down. So I was like, oh, let me jump in and create a website. Here's my big entry into our condo community. Let's put a website together. And I looked around and I looked at a couple of different CMSs, and I figured out basically on some demos that Drupal was really the way I wanted to go. And then I realized how big a learning curve it is, even for someone who knew as much CSS and HTML as I did. So that curve was there. That website never went public. But I was involved in the community, and that's really what kept me engaged in the community. I went to a couple of Drupal camps in New York City. I was involved in the Drupal community that was at New Jersey Institute of Technology here in Newark. So that was, again, that was part of my phase where, I want to be anything but a tech writer. And it kind of, at that point when I realized I wanted to create a site, the news aggregator site, I thought the easiest way or the best way to do it was in Drupal to kind of throw it together. And at one point I actually spoke with someone because at work, we were looking to do a DITA workflow, and I was like, oh, can we do a DITA to Drupal? And the guy's like, yeah, you can do it. but there was no real support there. There was no impetus behind it. So, the DITA world and my Drupal world are separate. I wish it wasn't the case. And I know that there is a revised interest in the DITA community for a DITA to Drupal module that people might want to look into. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes on edmarsh.com. So, yeah, there's a dichotomy there. But, because DITA's XML, Drupal's PHP, there's a little of that synergy of thinking kind of in code. But right now, for me, they're separate worlds.
Yeah, at my last job, we had a Drupal site, and that's where we published all of our content, our tech docs, our forum, our blog, our authentication system. It was all tied into Drupal, and Drupal's incredibly complex. And I to be honest, I didn't like Drupal. I did not like Drupal. Just because it was so freaking complex. We had to have like an outsourced agency in India really manage it. And it was like not just Drupal, but it was tied into Acquia too. So it had like all these development flows behind it. You couldn't just go in and like edit a file. You had to put it through a whole workflow. Anyway, but I brought this up because I feel like I had this split worldview between WordPress and techcomm tools for a long time, like years. I did a lot of WordPress consulting. I was really comfortable in like creating themes or doing design changes for people, implementing custom things. And then on the it's like I would blog on WordPress and create sites on WordPress during the night, and then the next morning I wake up and I go to some job where I'm working in Flare or I'm working in some other help authoring tool or system. And I got tired of this split worldview, and I kept asking myself, why should the publishing tools be split? If we want to excel in the web and have our primary output be the web, shouldn't we be using web tools? But they're also web tools are also challenging because a lot of times they don't do exactly what we're accustomed to wanting to. Now I can't speak. We often want to do things that you can't do so easily with them.
Right. I absolutely agree. There's no easy way to get DITA content onto the web without a lot of custom work. And that's what we did over the past year at our job. We basically created our own DITA to Confluence workflow. And it took a lot of work. And going back to Drupal, if you'll notice that this podcast is not on content.info, it's on edmarsh.com, which is a WordPress instance, because it was just so much easier to just install download a module in WordPress and go with it. With Drupal, I looked into it, of course, because I had experience with Drupal, and I thought if I'm going to have my content site on Drupal, I may as well put the podcast there. But there's no plug and play solution. It was, you can do this, but you have to create your own content type. You have to hook up the RSS feed so that way iTunes can do it. And it was just a lot of manual work. And at that point, I'm like, you know what? I don't want to be a developer anymore. I want to be a content creator. So, install the plugin in WordPress. It took 30 seconds. Well, I should say the first module that I used in WordPress, downloaded and installed in 30 seconds. And then I found out after I published my first podcast exactly why, because it wasn't very good. It wasn't very powerful. And it created that its own content type. So it wasn't in my mainstream on my WordPress page. So it was, so I learned, learning experience like everything. Moved over to a module called Blueberry, which seems to be very popular in podcasting. But again, there's nothing quite like that in Drupal. Go ahead.
When we tried to publish from DITA into Drupal, we actually looked into a solution that somebody had built. The main problem was that Drupal and WordPress and Joomla and other content management systems are not really designed to have you publish content into it and then republish content into it. Once you push a bunch of topics into Drupal, they stay there. You have to delete them. So you either have to like mass destroy them when you want to do a complete update, or you have to somehow you need a script that's smart enough to know that like your new set of docs doesn't have a topic that you had previously published and so forth. They're just set up to be the management system, not to be like an intermediary or an endpoint that you're publishing to from another management system. Anyway, we eventually abandoned it, and then I left there to join another company. But yeah, I mean, it was a problematic workflow, and I'd kind of given up on the WordPress solution for a while, or the Drupal, WordPress, other web CMS solutions.
Okay, so let's go back. I know you said that let's work in the language of the web, and you had a series of blog posts recently exactly about that. Well, I guess I first should ask you, what's your background in DITA and structured authoring, and at what point did you kind of move away from that structured authoring and that back end, front end kind of authoring workflow?
Well, when I was at Badgeville, I was experimenting with DITA and wrote a lot of content in DITA, in part because I'll admit it, there's so much industry hype and buzz around DITA that if you're not using it, you sometimes feel like you're outmoded or outdated. I remember,
even though it's a 10-year-old technology.
Yeah. Well, I remember I was at a conference once and talking to some content strategists from eBay, and they're like, "You don't use DITA? I really thought a professional like you would be using something XML standard like DITA." And I was like, "No, we're just publishing on Drupal." And so there's a lot of jobs that list DITA and XML as requirements. People are looking for experts, and so I was like, I better learn it. And it was interesting as well. It was like, oh, this is kind of cool. You have this whole model that's set up and designed for a tech writer or a tech doc situation. And having worked just in Drupal and HTML a lot, I was like tired of these systems that weren't really built for the scenarios that I was dealing with, where you have reuse things, or you have variables that you want to use, and other kinds of techniques. Anyway, I was working in DITA for a while, and then I moved to this new job, and they basically, at my company, we were using Confluence, but it was just behind the scenes. When you wanted to publish something externally, they have an scroll exporter plugin from K15 or KT something. Can't remember what it's called, but
K15T.
Yeah, K15T. It works really well if you need PDF, and you can export that content. They have some other stuff that does HTML as well, but so we were using that as a solution, and they said, we want to go online. We're done with PDFs. This is like archaic. This is 2015, 14. We're still publishing PDFs. Well, why are we doing this? We want to have an online, attractive, modern website.
Right.
And the project I was documenting had a lot of reuse. For example, there's 8 different outputs because there are 4 different programming languages across 2 different product lines, and later they added another 4 for like a special version. People are just using one piece of technology. So I had 12 outputs from the same source. So a lot of reuse, kind of a nightmare of reuse, to be honest. So many conditional tags, and it's hard to see. And I was like, DITA is perfect for this scenario. So I was the guinea pig or the experimenter. I said, I'll convert a project to DITA, see how it goes, and we'll convert all the other stuff, because my 2 other colleagues have like a mountain of content, and they want to be sure that they're moving to the right system. So we did a trial, and so I converted a bunch of content, probably like 200 pages of content, into DITA, and really just got into it, just self-learning, learning by trial and error, by reading things. Oxygen XML has incredible resources. They've got great documentation, tools, tutorials. So we were going to move to DITA, and it was going to be fine. But then my colleagues, so they're actually in another state, so I'm the only one in San Jose. They're off in Arizona. They were talking with some UX guys who sit near them, and the UX guys were like, "Why are you using XML? Why are you doing this?" Dragging their feet, and they're like, "Tom, is this the right way to go?" And I was like, "Well, I've always wanted to try a web solution. So if I really wanted to make like the WordPress thing work, but WordPress requires so much infrastructure that it makes it very difficult. You've got 8 different outputs. Well, with WordPress, you'd have to have 8 different instances of PHP Apache, MySQL,
Oh, geez.
maintaining all that and single sourcing between the 8 of them is it's not really built for that. So I was like, well, what's an alternative? And I know that these static site generators are very popular right now. There's like hundreds of them, only a handful that are really have traction. And so I went to this conference. Actually, and it was just a workshop at a conference. It was on API documentation, and a couple of the writers there were using DocPad and Jekyll. Like I sat down at a lunch table, and the person left on my left was using Jekyll, and on my right was using DocPad. And they're both static site generators. And in this API doc space where you have a lot of developers contributing, static site generators and other non-XML solutions are really much more common. In fact, it's very difficult to find a DITA solution where you've got API documentation. I've looked at a lot of the popular ones, and they're few and far between. You actually do find some that are like Flare driven, but most of them are custom websites.
Right.
And because in the API doc world, the docs are the interface that people use. It's not like, oh, I'm not going to use the documentation. I'll just figure it out myself. No, the documentation is what you get in order to interact with the API, really. I mean, of course, you're making calls and stuff, not actually doing it with the docs, but it is the interface more or less to the product. So most of the API doc sites are attractive. They sell, they sizzle, they're good looking. They have UX designers involved. And when you want to do good API documentation, either you have to kind of polish some front end skills or leverage some UX professional help or something. But it helps to use the language of the web, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, to really power that solution. And the XML was just not like something that there was a lot of support for with front end kind of design. So anyway, I did another trial, and we did this trial with Jekyll, same content, 8 different outputs and so forth. And it was really quite difficult to figure out how to single source this stuff, because most Jekyll sites they're either just like a company website or blog, or they're single sites. They're not like multi-site tools. A lot of doc sites actually. Anyway, so yeah, we did the Jekyll pilot, and it went a little better than the DITA. Mainly, I feel I don't like information typing, and that was my main problem. And I'm much more comfortable with CSS, JavaScript, and HTML than I am with XML transform technologies like XSLT. So
don't get me started. Please, just don't get me started on XSLT.
Yeah, you had something that you wrote a while back about how I guess this was your DITA to Confluence migration path. You had to do some XSLT stuff, right?
Yeah. What we did originally is we had all our content in RoboHelp, needed to get off of it, wanted to get to a firm-supported tool, which was either SharePoint or Confluence. SharePoint team said, you could do whatever you want, but we're not going to support it. So that made the decision kind of easy. Then I went to look into Confluence, realized not a place I want to work all day. I just didn't want to work in a text box in a browser all day. It was kind of clunky. Doing steps within steps or bullets within steps were really, really messy. And at that point, it seemed a lot easier to go from HTML to DITA than it was to go from HTML to Confluence, if that makes any sense. So I had to modify the HTML to DITA XSLT a little bit to match some of our styles and our custom CSS stuff like that, so that way we convert better. And it was a headache, but it convinced us that we didn't want to convert or use XSLT, modify the existing XSLT to get from DITA Open Toolkit into HTML into Confluence. So I took an XSLT class probably 2005 and didn't get my certificate in it. So I just can't get my head around it.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned in working with different tools, most people outside of techcomm in the workplace have absolutely zero interest in really kind of what tooling you're using.
Right.
They just care about the output. You know, is the content right? Is it accurate? Does it look decent? I switched entirely from DITA to Jekyll, and I don't think any of the project team even understood the difference. They'd never heard of either. They didn't understand why we were switching, what the real benefits are. You know, it was just like they just need to review stuff. I think that technical writers are the ones who obsess about tools, right? We're the ones who are using them, right? It's kind of like apps. I don't really care what people use to create the apps that I download on my iPhone. I just want to use the apps. Same thing with content. But I think I've been too focused on tools. And here's the real problem: is that if you focus on tools, your company doesn't give you any kind of research and development time usually to kind of tinker around and configure tools. I mean, you fit it in there because you have to do it, but they would rather everything just be like off the shelf. You push a button, it works, it looks beautiful, and there was no like development time in any of it. You focused all your time on writing content that we need for our product, you know. And so that's I don't know. Looking back, if I could find like an off-the-shelf solution that just worked and satisfied everything and only cost us whatever was in budget, I think people would be much happier than trying to forge your own theme and kind of pathway through the static site generator that requires a lot of customization.
See, interesting enough, I'm finding myself, now that I use Oxygen, which is an XML editor, it's a great, fantastic tool. Really stable, really slick, works really well. And I'm finding myself focusing more on content now than I was with RoboHelp when I had to constantly tweak the output, and it would rewrite my HTML, would rewrite my CSS, and it was like, I can't deal with this anymore. So now that I'm dealing with Oxygen and we figured out our workflow, it's a much, much better experience, and I really do like Oxygen a lot. I think they're doing great stuff. But let's take a step back. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing that I love about Oxygen and other text editors is that you get to work with documentation as text, as code. You know, you're not using a WYSIWYG editor for the most part. You can just edit the raw code, and I think that transition is huge. When you can move away from these WYSIWYG tools to just treating doc as code, it opens up all kinds of possibilities. You don't get stuck in formatting hell where you can't figure out why bullets have extra spacing or something, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to my before when I said, you know, I think tech writers at a minimum should know HTML and CSS, because you don't need to rely on a WYSIWYG. You don't really need to rely on a GUI. Anything that can write HTML, you can work in, and then you don't have to worry about which tool set is on your resume. You can say, I know HTML. I could just figure out how Flare or RoboHelp or whatever works in HTML.
Yeah.
Well, we should probably take a step back. You started talking about Jekyll. Can you tell us, it's a static site generator. What does that mean, and what are you authoring? I know you've mentioned Markdown. Can you kind of give us a little background on those two?
Sure. So, first of all, Jekyll is a static site generator, which means it takes a bunch of files on your local machine, and it processes them and it packages them into a nice looking output. Or at least an output, depending upon what theme you're using and so forth. The source format that you use can be Markdown, HTML, or also this templating language called Liquid, which is actually from another company called Shopify. So Markdown is a simple syntax. It's like a shorthand syntax, wiki-like syntax for creating HTML. There are different processors that basically take Markdown format and transform it into HTML. It's really primitive. You can't do a whole lot with it. You make lists and headings and links and tables. And when you need more than that, then you can slip into HTML and just code in HTML. Like if you want a definition list, or if you want, even if you want to put a class on a table, you're going to have to use HTML, because Markdown, while it has while it has tables, doesn't allow you to add classes onto different elements. But there's also, Jekyll has something called Liquid, which is like a really simplified programming language. It's a templating language. It's not like powerful enough to be called a programming language. But You can do variables. You can do reuse through something called includes. You can do conditional filtering. So you have like if statements, and you can also do some things that you can't do in other platforms. For example, you can do something called for loops. So you have a page, and you can add whatever metadata you want on the page in something called the front matter, which is just a block of text at the top. And then you can loop through all your pages and find all the pages that have certain front matter or that have certain metadata in that front matter. So I've been working on this REST API course. I'm trying to do it like a course because I have this upcoming workshop at the SDC Summit, and I want to take people through a course. So I have like a special set of pages that have metadata about this course information. And Jekyll is looping through these pages, looking for certain metadata about like the course name and the weight of the page. And Jekyll is ordering them based on that metadata. So you can do a lot of things with this. That's only one example, but you can do a lot of things that you can't. For example, you could also do tags and categories. You can create like special JSON outputs for your content by just looping through all your pages and pushing that into a template. And this is probably where it becomes more, in a way, it's more of a structured authoring capability than people might think. With API documentation, you have very specific sections that you want to repeat. For example, your resource description, your endpoint, your sample response, your parameters, your status codes. If you have a dozen endpoints, you're going to have those same sections on each of your pages. Well, you could create a template that has kind of these placeholders for each of those sections. You create these other pages that just have the information in key value pairs. For example, resource : description, and then whatever it is. And then you can create, I know this is not really making a lot of sense. You create a for loop that looks through all those pages and pushes it into the template. So you have a separation between your content and your template layer that allows you to do a lot more with your theming. So that kind of stuff gives you freedom and flexibility. This is why I said I didn't like information types, is because, well, first of all, there is no information type for a REST API template.
Okay.
Right. I mean, you have sections, basically, generic sections. And you create your own sort of templates. Or if you don't want to use a template, you don't have to. You just add the same sections on every page. It gives you a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, you can shoot yourself in the foot with that flexibility, right? If you open up the code and say, do whatever you want, then you suddenly have to say, well, why is this not working? What did I break? What did I screw up now? Because every time you make a tweak, you're jeopardizing the code. You may have broken your site. Whereas if you have an off-the-shelf solution, they're going to close off everything you're going to potentially break and just allow you to do stuff in a very confined space, and you have fewer chances of breaking the output.
So how does something like a static site generator fit in for companies whose main presence is a CMS like WordPress or Drupal? Is it complementary? Do they talk to each other other than through links? How does it work in a corporate environment?
Yeah, if you've got a content management system, you probably wouldn't want static site generator. I mean, in some ways, Oxygen XML is a static site generator. It generates static output of HTML files.
True.
And you could feed that output into another system, but you'd have to customize the template in just one way. Let me give an example where somebody actually wanted me to do something, and I pushed back. We've got a Salesforce instance, and all of our customer account logins, contacts, and stuff is in Salesforce. So in order to authenticate users, the salespeople or the account management people wanted to just use Salesforce because then they don't have to provision new accounts, they don't have to deprovision accounts, and so forth. It's just all right there. And the only really content management tool in Salesforce is this little component called Knowledge, which is a knowledge base article. And you can import content in an CSV format into Salesforce and have it populate into their knowledge base tool. So using Jekyll, I could actually create a CSV template that would loop through my pages and push the content into a CSV format and then import that into Salesforce. So, similar tools might have other import formats, and you could create a template that is custom tailored to whatever that import format needs to be to fit into this larger system. But here's the problem, and this is why I push back on it. Once you import content into the other system, how do you manage it? Like, let's say I have a new release. Let's say I've uploaded all my content into Salesforce and it looks great in Knowledge. And then I have version 2.0 coming out. I've got to suddenly bulk delete everything and republish things. And I don't know if people have linked to them, if I'm getting everything. It's just kind of a nightmare. It's probably doable. It's just anytime you have two different systems, it's going to be, you're going to have to make them play together.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. It took us a year and a half to figure out how to get DITA to Confluence. And we're doing it through the back end through basically Confluence has a folder structure, and we're publishing it that way. But like I said, getting HTML out of DITA is really easy. Getting the Confluence version of HTML is a lot harder, and that was part of the stuff that we had to struggle.
Well, tell me, why are you publishing from DITA to Confluence? Why not just author directly in Confluence, use the macros to do whatever kind of includes or reuse needs you have?
Again, when I played around with Confluence, it was just not authoring in a browser GUI all day with a button bar and no control over the formatting, no control over the back end. It was difficult. It was just really, really difficult to work in. And our company, the firm, has changed wikis over the years. So and us be able to work offline, we have control over it. We have it backed up in version control. And if need be in the future, we can publish to a new output and move to a new server, move to a new content management system without a whole lot of problem or having to get everything out of Confluence, out of its wiki markup and into something more usable. But really it was, I didn't want to work in Confluence all day in, what Karen McGrain has called blobs. And it was just not great to work in. And also, like I said, getting HTML into DITA seemed, strangely enough, a lot easier. And frankly, I'm much happier that we're doing it this way. We have all the reuse on the back end. We have shared graphics folders for all our applications. So everything gets shared, everything gets reused. And we have tons of control on the back end. And I just like I said, Oxygen is just a really nice tool to work in on a daily basis. So I'm happy we went that route.
Yeah, I agree. Working locally on your machine with text files is like so much faster than loading things in a browser. And this is part of why I never really pushed the whole WordPress option, is because you'd have to work with the browser to do all of that, and trying to manage files, move them around,
right,
change their names, edit this one and that one and this one. It's just so slow in a browser, even with a good connection.
Right. So, what tool do you work in on a daily basis then? Are you basically fire up a text editor beginning of the day and live in there?
I have grown to love WebStorm or IntelliJ. They're kind of the same tool. I actually have it's by a company called JetBrains. I don't know what the name of that is about, but IntelliJ is actually like a Java IDE.
Right.
And it's what I had a license for at work. All I really wanted was WebStorm, which was the text editor version, which is like more stripped down for JavaScript, HTML, CSS needs, but didn't have a license for that. So I just don't use a lot of the features in the IDE. But it is great because IntelliJ treats your folder or treats your files in a folder as a project. So you can do very good find and replace operations. You can see where something is used. The find and replace is huge because there's no link management in these tools.
Right.
If you change a link, you got to figure out where all the instances where you've named it as such. And it just is great. I mean, there's a markdown plugin so that you can, when you do like a double pound sign, it'll actually put it in blue and makes it easy to see your headings. So yeah, I like working in a text editor. I liked working in Oxygen XML. I mean, it's just it's so much better. It's so much better than browser-based tools. And as much as I kind of liked Confluence at one point, when they switched away from their source syntax to the rich text editor, I can't use it. Lots of people now can use it, which is probably a great business decision. Developers, engineers, they're fine with it. But man, working in that WYSIWYG view is just a nightmare. So another problem with Confluence, and I don't mean to really bag on Confluence, but as a wiki, it's prone to just collecting a lot of junk content. Wikis grow and grow, and nobody ever trims them back. Nobody wants to delete pages. A lot of times you don't have the capability to delete pages. And so you end up with just endless content, and you don't even know what's relevant anymore. When I worked in MediaWiki, we had the same problem. We had like 1,000 pages, and I had all kinds of ambition to go through and find out what was relevant, what wasn't. I couldn't find out who had authored it, who was using it. Like, it was a nightmare. And so, if you've got, I think the wiki model just kind of fails in some instances. It's great for collaboration internally, but yeah, as an external publishing platform, it's just riddled with problems.
Yeah, I agree. I can see that. We're thankful we do all internal documentation, so it's all internally facing. But I was grateful as we were trying to figure this whole thing out with the DITA to Confluence. I actually went through our largest application help and did the edit and did all that stuff because there was stuff in there that was obsolete. There was just stuff that was terrible. So I got the luxury of doing just that cleanup on one of them. And of course, the other ones that we just threw up there and converted straight over, we're going back because we have problems and stuff's out of date. We're able on our side to what we control to be able to manage the amount of content that's up there, take it up, move it around. But I know that there's other instances of Confluence in the firm that have only been around a year or two, and it's same thing. It's just there's just all kinds of stuff that's all over the place. I call SharePoint the place where documents go to die, and I think maybe Confluence might be along that way too.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I'm not working in SharePoint world anymore, but I know it's subject to the same thing. I mean, you've got to have some way to empower everybody in your company to publish and share information, and it's not like there are better solutions. I once had a post where I ripped on Confluence, and people emailed me asking me to provide insight onto what I recommended. And I was like, sorry, I don't know what I recommend internally. Interestingly, GitHub, they actually they don't use SharePoint, they don't use Confluence, they use Git repositories to manage and share content. So, that's obviously something that would only work with an engineering type of company, but it is one alternative.
Was that your blog post, the person who wrote that GitHub is documenting using GitHub or something like that? It's kind of meta.
Yeah. I put a link to that. There's GitHub is based in San Francisco, and I've met some of the writers there, and they're a big sponsor of Jekyll. So there's a feature called GitHub Pages where if you just, Git is a revision control repository software. You commit to it, and GitHub Pages will build your Jekyll site, so you don't have to build it locally. It would be like checking in your Oxygen files, and the server just builds your outputs. So it's kind of cool like that.
Nice. That is cool. I guess the question then is for you, Tom. If you had a choice about your perfect technical authoring environment, what would it be?
All right, so I think that an environment that has good challenges is the perfect environment. It comes back to story, right? A good story has interesting challenges that face the protagonist. And life is like that story. If we don't have challenges, it's boring. So if I had an environment where there were no challenges, it would not interest me. That said, some challenges I'd rather not have, like having thousands and thousands of pages of legacy documentation in like FrameMaker that I had to fix. Yeah, that's not me. Or being micromanaged or something. You know, I don't want to be in that situation. I love the flexibility. I love the feel of a startup. There are like 35 people in my office. There's a kitchen full of food, and I love the kind of closeness and camaraderie. I like startups. I like challenges. I like kind of being able to do what I want in terms of the outputs. So I've been very fortunate not to be trapped in a tool. I think so often in companies, you go in and you've already got mountains of documentation in a certain format. It's very difficult to change. So if you want to innovate, you want to experiment and try something new, you just can't, because you can, but then you'd have to somehow deal with all that legacy information, and you don't usually have time or energy to do it. So perfect environment. I feel like I'm in it right now. I mean, I have flexibility to determine the output. I get this great opportunity to pilot Jekyll and figure out how to use it for techcomm. I have challenging technologies to learn. I have a startup type feel, even though we're part of a larger company, and it's in Silicon Valley, so it's like the mecca of tech around here. People just live and breathe code, and programmers are everywhere, and startup companies. So startups are fun because there's so much like enthusiasm to launching a 1.0 project. And I love working on documentation for 1.0 products because you get to design it from scratch. I really hate getting into a situation where there's already a bunch of content written that I don't know much about. Like, is it accurate? Who wrote it? Is it even complete? Anyway, why do we need it? So starting from scratch is something that really appeals to me. So nice. All right, Tom. Well, I know you want to catch the NBA Finals, so let's wrap up a little bit. But I do thank you. I didn't honestly, I didn't know the power of Markdown and Jekyll until you came on and talked about it. And I know you had those blog posts, and I was like, I don't know. But then you're talking about the reuse and the includes and the auto building. It's something we should all probably consider looking into. So thanks for your insight on Markdown versus DITA and Jekyll. Sure. Well, thanks, Ed, for having me. I enjoyed this podcast. It's fun to be interviewed, and it's fun to interact and cool. Talk with you. We'll have to have you again sometime. Like I said, this is, when I made a list of people to come on, I'm like, well, I got to have Tom Johnson, but I got to work my way up to Tom Johnson level. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you talking about your experience on the other coast. Do you want to remind everyone where we can find you? Just I'd rather be writing.com. You can find me there. Or on Twitter, if you're big onto Twitter, @ Tom Johnson. There you go. You can find me on Twitter @ Ed Marsh, keeping it simple. You can also find me and this podcast on edmarsh.com. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the Content Podcast on iTunes. Please also like us and write us a review. I don't think we have any up there yet. And come on, you're all writers out there. Give me a review. Help me out a little bit. So until then, thanks again, Tom. We will talk to you all soon. Yeah, have a great day. Take care. Thanks.